Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I think we'll maybe just make a start now and keep admitting people as we go along. So thanks very much for joining us for this morning's event, Reimagining Ownership. My name is Strachan. I'm the coordinator for the Glasgow Tool Library. And we're mainly used to putting on carpentry and craft events. So it's a little bit different for us, and it's really amazing to see so many people tuning in. I hope you all enjoy the discussion today from three great speakers from three fantastic organisations. So first of all, just a bit of housekeeping, just to say that we're recording this event. Please, could you keep yourself on mute just to avoid any background noise? If you could also maybe keep your video switched off, it might help with any connection issues, as I think we sold quite a lot of tickets, so we might have quite a lot of people joining us today. We're going to leave the chat box open. If you could first of all just let us know, leave a comment and say where you're joining us from. But also you can leave any comments or questions in there. My colleague Kat's going to be keeping an eye on it, and we'll be selecting a few questions for people to respond to after the presentations. So the event today is planned to go on until 12:30 British time. We'll make sure that it doesn't go on any longer than this, and depending on the amount of questions and discussion at the end, we might finish up a little earlier, but we'll see how it goes. So the plan for today is to have three presentations around 50 minutes each from each of the speakers, and then some questions and discussion at the end. So again, thanks all very much for coming and to this talk, Reimagining Ownership. I'm just going to spend a few minutes explaining who we are at the Glasgow Tool Library and why we're putting on this talk exploring alternative forms of ownership. Many of you may already know what tool libraries are, or may already be a member or have set up a tool library yourselves. I think there's a few people joining us around the world in the UK who have, and it's a big community, growing community. But tool libraries work like normal libraries, but instead of sharing books, we share tools. We collect donations of tools from individuals, organizations, and institutions. We repair, maintain, and safety check them and make them accessible to everyone through an annual membership. The whole premise comes from the idea that we don't need to all own things like tools. We just need to be able to access them when we need to use them. This idea also relates to lots of our other items, which, like tools, are often very expensive and take up valuable spaces in our homes, such as equipment for events, gazebos and marquees, camera and film equipment, and equipment for sports and camping and outdoor activities. Sabrina from the Brisbane Tool Library is going to be talking about tool libraries in a bit more depth, I think, so I won't go into too much detail, but just want to focus on one of the reasons why we set up the tool library, which is that although it's such a simple concept, tool libraries embody and promote communal forms of ownership that challenge our wasteful, buy, use, dispose consumerism. Ownership is such a key issue in our economy, politics, and culture, and it's something that, as an organisation, we want to explore and to challenge. Models of ownership have, throughout history, shaped our behaviours, relationships to each other and to the environment. The privatisation of land, natural resources, public services, national utilities, and the development of shareholder corporate economy all promote the accumulation of property and wealth by an ever-diminishing number of private individuals. This model of ownership is built to extract private wealth from assets and resources that could be owned, and in many cases used to be owned and managed, for the benefit of society and future generations. This model of ownership also erodes our sense of community, prioritising individual success over the common good. We have created economies that are built on the idea of growth, but in order to create growth, private ownership needs to be expanded into more and more areas of society through privatisation. Furthermore, our model of buy, use, dispose consumerism, where we're encouraged to own things but never value them, is producing waste on a huge scale that is destroying our ecological systems. The issue of ownership also crosses into so many other issues, such as slavery and colonialism, women's rights throughout history, and the ownership we have over our own bodies and identities. Tool libraries, we think, although in themselves won't address all these issues, they do provide an alternative form of owning that is more fulfilling, fun, communal, and resilient. As highlighted, the issue of ownership is so important And the types of future we create, we would argue, depends on the models of ownership we use to build it. So we have three speakers who are really pleased to have with us today, all of whom who are fighting for alternative models of ownership that are democratic, ecological, and social. So we have Sabrina from the Brisbane Tool Library, Carey from Community Land Scotland, and Thomas Hanna from the Democracy Collaborative. So that's all from me. Just now, I'm going to pass over to Sabrina, and then we're going to listen to all talks and then have some time right at the end for questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. Okay, let me do this. So, can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm zooming in from Brisbane. It's 8 p.m. here. Just had dinner. I'm very tired, but very excited and to share some folks with you and to learn from the other speakers as well. Well, before starting, I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander custodian of this land that for many centuries, they actually managed in a sustainable way this country that today we call Australia. So we surely have a lot to learn from First Nation people around the world. As Chris said, I started a Brisbane Tool Library back in 2017. I'm also doing a PhD, and I try to combine these two things, although the topics of my PhD is very different. So I like to usually start with this question: how could we create an unsustainable society? And if we look at, are we growing consumption per capita? Yes. Are we abusing of natural resources? Yep, on track. Are we overusing our soils and fishery? Are we polluting water and air? Anyway, we are unfortunately achieving all of this, and the risk of pandemics that we're experiencing is just a reminder of how abusing of nature and deforestation can lead also to bigger health effects, in this case, the COVID-19. When I was younger, I tried to fight, against deforestation for the reef and for all these other environmental issues, but I couldn't choose one social or environmental issue to focus on. And I came to the conclusion after educating myself and researching that actually economic growth, the current capitalist system that is its imperative is growth, is the cause of all these problems. What is economic growth? Obviously, it's really hard to summarize everything in one slide, but I would say that is the obsession with increasing GDP, which is basically the index that measures the economic monetary transaction. This index, just to give you an idea, a standing forest doesn't have any economic value today, but if we cut it down and turn it into furniture or other product that can be sold and shipped around the world, that increases GDP. Is a term that is a term that we're gonna hear a lot now in the crisis, but we will see that there are other indexes that could actually measure the social and ecological well-being. Economic growth aims accumulation of capital, accumulation for accumulation's sake, and we're seeing this pandemic highlighted even more the inequality that this system is producing. And I would like to remind everyone that we produce goods that needs to be sold, and they're not really just there to fulfill our needs, and that our needs, as Callis writes, are socially constructed. So if we start from this framework, then we can understand a little bit more why we need to act against this hungry economic system. Just to give you a more practical example, so moving away from the macro perspective, one tool that the economy uses to just continue this growth is planned obsolescence. Since the 70s, industrial designers have been educated to design for planned obsolescence, which means that we are buying products that they're designed to break down. Why? So that to sell more products, so that consumers have to buy a new printer, a new phone, and so on every couple of years or every couple of months. Obviously, this has a problem in the production side, but it's also creating a lot of e-waste. There are a lot of solutions. Well, I changed the title of this slide several times. I came down to the real honest truth is that there are a lot of greenwashing solutions out there now. Decoupling is probably one that we hear a lot, which means that our current economic growth system could continue as it is, aiming at growth, but we could, in theory, produce green products or produce more efficiently products, but keep growing the economy. Well, this is great, except that there is no progress happening in this field. There's a lack of evidence that actual absolute decoupling could be achieved by this. And if it could be achieved, well, we're not, respecting the ecological limits that our models are showing us before an eventual collapse. And the most important thing that I think about relative decoupling is that capitalism itself has never been against producing something efficiently. So if we can produce more products with less energy or less cost, well, capitalism will do it if that translates in capital accumulation. Unfortunately, although I use sometimes in my presentation the word circular economy is more and more also used as a substitute of sustainable development or of other sustainability terms, and is losing a bit its core of bringing a proper new circular economy. And anyway, I will talk later if you have a question about what's wrong with the circular economy today. So the good news is that there are alternative economic systems, and I'm very much alienated with the economic degrowth principle that we can summarize as a voluntary and equitable downscaling of the economy toward a sustainable, just, and participatory steady-state economy. And I would like to highlight that voluntary and equitable downscaling, because degrowth should not be confused with recession. So recession is what we are seeing during the pandemic. People say, oh, we are degrowing and the world is not going very well. Well, not really. The recession has not been planned and it's not voluntary. Alexander, that is a great intellectual based in Melbourne here in Australia, defines degrowth as a planned contraction of the energy and resources, especially in the overgrown economies. And I like to highlight overgrown economies because I don't want to have any imperialistic thinking about what other countries should do. So I think that Western countries, those that are consuming most resources per capita, should start to downscale the economy so that we can achieve more social justice, ecological sustainability beyond consumerism and productivism. If we look at this image, I think that we are seeing that at the macro level, our governments are failing us. Our governments are not democratically working for the well-being of most of the population for many reasons that we can debate. At the micro level, I think that expecting people to live a sustainable life, yes, it should be a thing to do, but it's not enough. In fact, we can't expect people to produce their own shampoo, cycle everywhere, make their bread, etc., while being in the current capitalistic economy. So because these two levels are failing, and because the question sometimes is where do we start from, I think that we should start in the middle. I think that at the meso level, communities are the real agent of change, and I will show how we are trying in our little bubble here in Brisbane to do something with the tool libraries by rebuilding the commons. So Chris said what a tool library is basically a library of things. It works like a book library, but for things. Here a little bit our journey, and I'm really trying to squeeze a lot of concept and information in a short presentation, but I would really like to leave more time for the discussion at the end. So when we started in 2017, we started just by collecting stuff from people. So driving around the city, getting SMS, Facebook messages. So it was very a sporadic process of going around whenever someone would contact us. Then we became a bit more organized. So we started collecting every couple of weeks tools from Brisbane City Council recovery centers, so recycling center, landfill station. And as you can see, this was the pickup in 2018 of one trip only. And a lot of the tools are brand new. So I love to show this picture because this is what waste is in our society. And you might think that a lot of these things come from people, and yes, they do, but they also come from businesses or shops that close down, restaurants that close down, etc. Uh, we have also other ways of collecting tools, and now that we have a stable place since 2018, people actually drop them at the tool library. Then we clean everything, and sometimes that's enough to give it a second life and to be used again. But other times we have to test and tag to make sure that they are safe to use, and also to respect the legislation in Queensland and in Australia. Once everything is checked from an electrical point of view, we take pictures and add them in the inventory. And here are some old photos of our volunteers, but it's great to actually remember those times. And then everything is uploaded online, and as a book library, you can book your things and just come and pick them up. This is our model, just to give you an example on a macro scale. So we really try to maximize the use within, the tool library. So by lending them to our members, to lending the tools to our members, we receive them on the up left from, as I said, City Council, but we also partnered with removal companies. And I really encourage you, I saw in the chat that some people were thinking of starting a tool library, to see if any removal company would like to collaborate with you, because sometimes they just get a call, go and empty a business. So it would reduce their cost of bringing stuff to landfill, and it would give you some access to resources. The resources that we don't want for various reasons, we give them to other organizations. And we can't legally repair e-waste, I mean electrical appliances in Queensland if you're not an electrician. So that becomes e-waste, but instead of sending it to a landfill, we actually give it to another social enterprise, and they open up the e-waste and try to maximize the parts, innovating with them. And then finally, people can come at the tool library and borrow. Again, we don't have just power tools. We have Christmas decoration, kayaks, camping stuff, and many other items. We also organize workshop. A workshop usually have the only goal is to organize them around transferable skills, which means skills that people can pass on to the community. We organize some introduction to power tools, because we realize that people like me are not actually tool skilled. And so if we had the tools and the resources, but not the skills, then the inventory would have not been used enough. But we also did a bike repairing workshop, beeswax wrapping. So it's all around reducing consumption and waste and giving these skills to the community. Since 2018, we are based at the State Library of Queensland, which is a public library. And I think that it's great. Well, beyond the really solid support that we received since, and the free rent. I think that reclaiming back public spaces, reclaiming back the circular economy within public institution is really important, because one of the critiques of the circular economy is that it's being privatized and used as greenwashing for the big brands, while we are actually losing spaces. And so the State Library has been open enough to allow us to operate from there. So if you look a little bit at the benefits that tool libraries could bring in a community, well, there's obviously the environmental sustainability one. Tool libraries help reducing the ecological footprint and by reducing consumption. And I really want to emphasize that, because a lot of the time people say, oh yeah, it reduces waste. Yes, but sorry. I feel when we talk about waste or about post-consumer goods, it's already too late. So our goal is really to reduce consumption. Obviously, we also reduce waste by maximizing the use phase of these goods. Therefore, we save resources that are not needed to produce items that might be underutilized. We try to stimulate also repair when possible. Another benefit of the tool library is to save money, obviously to people that don't need to buy these items, but also to people that can finally have access to maybe cost prohibitive tools. It reduces costs also to your councils and to your states. And I would really emphasize that you should use that as a way to partner with councils and states. And finally, if you look up in internet, last year, there was an article called Airbnb for Things. So people are accumulating so many things that now are renting spaces in other people's houses to save, to put their stuff. So if we look at the fact that urbanization is increasing and that we will be more and more concentrated in dense cities, well, actually Tool Library would give access to items that don't need to be stuck at home. Therefore, we can, by consequence, redesign cities around accessing and borrowing, and that would allow to save space to everyone in houses and in cities. Tool libraries, I think that they can reduce inequalities. I don't have any statistic or data in that, and I hope that future study will look more into that. But obviously, by giving access or prioritizing access over ownership, that's a way to allow also low-income people to access a full inventory of things. But it also changes the relationship between positional good, which are those good that give status, and useful good. So, you know, for example, we can see in our tool library that some family, they might borrow camping stuff and go to camping trips with their families, and there may be activities that before they couldn't do. So it changes a little bit the dynamic, giving access to experiences to people also from low socioeconomic background. And finally, I think that it engages and recreates a resilient neighborhood, that they're not always dependent on the external inputs. Workshops, as I said, they upskill the community. I should admit that I started the Tool Library and I couldn't even name 10 items, and I still can't use them. So I can name now some tools. So I realized that my generation just grew up in this consumerist and productivist society. So we didn't learn anything at school or through family, unfortunately. So the idea is to help people becoming more materialistic and less consumeristic. So Richard Dennis, in his book, defines materialism as the love of materials, which he's actually proposed that we should be more materialistic. We should look more after our materials, repairing and eventually passing those objects or those items to the next generation, while consumerism is more the love of buying things and not the love of things, because if we would love things, we would maintain and care for them. Workshop help to build self-confidence, and overall I think the goal of workshops, which is to overcome this alienation of the consumerist culture and to try to explore how we can do it ourselves without relying on external goods and services. So what has all this to do with ownership? Well, I think that tool libraries can bring, they're like pockets of experimentation for the commons. And my colleague Shane and I defined the commons as resource and assets that they're taken care by a community, and in which people have the right to use them without having the need to own them. And there's a plan on how to manage them. And that plan part is really important because unfortunately, we hear too much about the tragedy of the commons, and that is used as a reason for capitalism and private property to justify the fact that if something is not private, then it's going to be abused of. But the reality is that the tragedy of the common, well, there's a larger critique in that in the literature, but it didn't have a plan. So I think that planning and organizing the community around how to manage these assets is really important. The common means reevaluating our social relationships and by consequence also the resources that are needed by our communities, and eventually by constraining consumption, by giving use right and not ownership, we can achieve that absolute decoupling, so an absolute dematerialization of the economy so that we would respect the limits of planet Earth. But the commons are more than just shared resources with a plan. The commons are important because of the process of commoning. And I put there some pictures on our slides. We try to do at the Tool Library a lot of workshop, about a lot of social events, because it's the commoning, the process that helps actually, fostering strong communities. So it's a way of valuing differently the time and the people and the things around us. And the idea would be that people would be part of multiple commons, so like part of Tool Library, as well as community gardens, seed libraries, cooperatives, unions. So if we really get this right, we could achieve a more sustainable society. So the common could contribute to economic degrowth, but by enhancing simplicity. So that would be a need-oriented production and consumption, which obviously needs to evolve in parallel with a change on values. This could prompt a more high-quality production of items, and therefore, we could contrast planned obsolescence and everything that goes with it. So the positive, let's start with a negative thing. So I put up some challenges that we are facing every day. And this is Naomi Klein saying that basically there are thousands of groups like us, probably having other webinars right now or having meetings that try to fight and protect these commons, these resources in the world. And so Klein says, thousands of groups today are all working against forces whose common thread is what might broadly be described as the privatization of every aspect of life and transformation of every activity and value into commodity. We often speak of privatization of education, healthcare, and natural resources. But if you really think about it, water is being privatized, labor rights, genes, DNA, we are seeing this with the vaccines. So the commons are much more than just power tools, and we should really look into this other aspect of our commons that we need to protect. So the positive things that Harvey says is the common is not therefore something extant once upon a time that has since been lost, but is something like the urban common that is continuously being produced. So that's the positive things. The negative thing is that capitalism keep commodifying every aspect that is produced by the common. And we see it especially now in Brisbane, and probably Europe went through it before Brisbane or Australia, because it's a pretty young country here. But gentrification is exactly this example. Suburbs are vibrant, our artists make it vibrant, the community groups make it vibrant, and then finally big developers come and destroy these commons richness. And we as a Brisbane Tool Library are really struggling finding another second location because of this commodification of spaces. Other challenges that we have with the commons is, I think, trust in people. Not that there is a problem in that, but I feel that we have not been educated to trust and collaborate. And so we have really to rework out that education. And something really interesting that made me think about that trust is when I started a Tool Library, a lot of people kept asking us, what if someone steals something or doesn't return it? And I was always very surprised about that question. And I started answering, well, except if that person is you, then 99% of people are actually good people. And then people would step back because, we are culture is based on competition, is based on this neoliberal idea that we are individuals and not community. So we have to rebuild that trust in the community. And with that trust, we also have to rebuild or to relearn or to explore more skills and decision-making processes to keep communities and commons and groups as democratic as possible. And I think that the size does matter, because a lot, of organizations or university now, they push you to start your own startup and scale up and colonize the world. But I think that with that scaling up of one single organization, then we do risk to give up some democratic processes in there. I think that another challenge that we see is that probably the organization groups are not coordinated enough, or they don't collaborate for various reasons. And all of these three, I think that they're more internal challenges, while there's this other big external one, which is access to the land, access to spaces. And I know that a lot of tool libraries around the world struggle, and the main reason of struggling is having an accessible free rent or with cheap rent space in the city. And finally, we all know that most of these organizations, such as ourselves, we suffer from the pressure of, you know, the labor market, or of the imperatives of working for an income, and therefore we are all run just by volunteers, and that doesn't allow us to explore the full potential of what tool libraries could bring to the community. So I think that while capitalism tries to make scarcity an important aspect of our life, and therefore to sell us what we can't have, I think that the real question that we can reflect on today or in the coming days, how can we live in abundance? I think we have enough for everyone. Is just how can we own, access, and share that enough? And not that I have any particular wisdom to share, but I came up with a few points as probably a conclusion. I think that the first thing we have to acknowledge and reflect on is we can't do it alone. And again, you know, with this new startup fashionable way, we want to be the founders of everything. We want to be the solo agent of change, but we really have to acknowledge that we can't, and therefore we have to join other existing projects. You know, there are already a lot of, I'm sure that wherever you are today, there are surely existing projects that need more volunteers, that need maybe more energy, fresh motivation. And if they don't exist, well, the only other thing to do is to start your own with and within the community. I think that we also have to actively resist and refuse the growth-driven system in an explicit way. We don't have the privilege anymore to be politically correct, or to talk about green capitalism, or to accept any of the features of the current system. And that comes with basically giving hope, I think, to communities, to keep alive the idea that a non-capitalist society can happen. We need innovation, and I put in italic that innovation just because I really enjoy for fun to use all these capitalist words and use them for good. So I do indeed think that we kind of need some innovation, but not a technological one. Although technology can be used for good, but I think that we really need to rethink our social structures. And Harvey says we need to find ways to create, you know, to channel this power of the collective for the common good. And finally, as Klein says, we need all these local movement to work within their local boundaries, but to have and fit international economic agenda so that we can indeed shift to a post-growth economy. I like to finish with this because I really think that we can't change our planet, but we can change the economy. And when we look at it like that, then it seems a bit more feasible. Here's some books, and I'm more than happy to share the slides with anyone at the end of the presentation, or Chris can send it. Some books that maybe you might like to read to explore more what economic degrowth is. You can also read those references, but unfortunately, because ownership in academia is a thing, all of these papers might require you to pay. And here are my contact details, and I hope that I wasn't too long.
Thanks very much, Sabrina. That was great. I really like the distinction between materialism and consumerism. Who is it who said that, sorry? Richard
Dennis in the book Curing Affluenza.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, please leave any questions in the comments in the chat section. And we're just going to move on to Carey Doyle from Community Land Scotland.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you see that? Chris, great. Thanks for that, Sabrina. That was fascinating. That was really great. What I'm going to do is pick up some of the points I suppose that she mentioned about land, and give some insight into what's been happening in Scotland around land and community ownership. I'm just going to give you a short introduction on community ownership of land and buildings here in Scotland, because I'm assuming that much of the audience isn't familiar with all of this. So there's quite a lot of basic information there, and then some detail on how community ownership works here, and what community ownership have been achieving, and then talk about where things are going. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of Community Land Scotland. We're a small organization that was established in 2010 by those involved in community land buyouts in rural Scotland. They were responding to their own concern that communities weren't taking advantage of what we see as transformative potential of community ownership of land and buildings. So we're very much the voice of Scotland's community owners. We're led by our board, all of whom are actively involved in community ownership projects themselves, and we have a handful of staff. We work on promotion of community ownership, and land reform, support for community ownership groups, and research and policy recommendations. So getting into the history then of community land ownership in Scotland, well, it has a long history here. Community buyout started in the modern era in 1920, but you can think about it as a contemporary wave, which was started in the 1990s. And here's some early examples with Ascent Crossforders and the Isle of Egg, but going all the way through. I've given an example of a high profile buyout that happened in the south of Scotland at Langmore Moor, from the largest private landowner in Scotland, the Duke of Buccleuch, which is just, I think, proceeded last week, in March anyway. Papers were exchanged on that. So there's huge amounts going on currently, and it goes back to this long and rich history. I wanted to give some examples around the Isle of Egg, just so that people can understand the issues in Scotland, and the kinds of solutions that communities are coming up with. So in Egg, it's a small island of Skye, of the south of the Isle of Skye. There was a single landlord who controlled housing and commercial opportunities. So needless to say, there weren't too many opportunities for housing and businesses. There was a lack of infrastructure. There was no electricity grid. There was unemployment, and there was depopulation. People were leaving and not coming back. The community raised money to buy out the island, 1.5 million, from an early crowdsourced type approach. They bought the land and had since invested across the board. Check out their website and you can get a sense for everything that they've done. They've built affordable housing, community center, which is mixed uses with commercial in there, as well as community. They've built a renewables-based microgrid on the island, and they've increased the population, almost doubled it, I think, but on their own terms, which is quite important. So land reform in Scotland, it's a work in process. The concentration of land ownership in Scotland is the most unequal in Europe. 2012-16, landowners held 10% of private rural land, and that's really not changed much since 1970. And there's another statistic there is about slightly over 1,000 people own 70% of rural Scotland. So this is ultimately because of the history of concentration of land ownership into fewer and fewer private estates in rural areas of Scotland, which was a rising of systems of wealth extraction, really as part of global colonial systems. And those have stayed, the size, the concentration of landholding has stayed largely the same since that period. And land reform seeks to make the landholding system in Scotland more equal because of that basis. So some key developments then. In 2003, so responding to those successes in the 90s of those early buyouts, which happened without an infrastructure in place in terms of political will and land reform rights, et cetera, responding to that, and because of the Scottish Parliament was able to put through some land reform acts, 2003, removing the feudal land system. Anyone in Scotland who's purchased land will be surprised to see all the feudal paperwork which comes with the house of property purchase in Scotland. This is all very much recent history, not anything that predates this century. The Land Reform Acts introduced the rural community right to buy, which introduces, again, this idea that of communities and collective ownership have a role within property, and introduced the Scottish Land Fund, which is centralized funding for community buyouts. And then another key legal development in land reform in Scotland has been 2015, the Community Empowerment Act and a related Land Reform Act, which rolled out these rights, which were previously held just in rural areas to all of Scotland. So if rural areas were able to put in place that transformative benefit, such as the Isle of Egg, that should be applied across Scotland to urban areas, and introduces this notion of this collective right to ownership of land and properties. So currently in Scotland, there's three main routes to buying land: negotiated sales from a private owner, similar to a private purchase. There's a community right to buy, and there's 5 of them, with various legal basis for that. And there's also asset transfer from public authorities. The ownership model for community ownership of land and building is that it should be open to all, that it's non-profit distributing, and it's reinforced with these legal rights as well as funding from the Scottish government for geographic communities who seek to buy. And there should be evidence of community support for the project as well. So where are we now with community ownership in Scotland? The last set of data came out at the end of 2020, and there were 590 assets owned by 418 community groups, covering a large area, larger than the central belt of Scotland, really. The nature of the type and the nature of developments that communities have put forward is absolutely vast. There are so many examples. If you're looking for inspiration, there's plenty to be had. Affordable housing, renewable energies, nature reserve, woodlands, harbors and pontoons, high street buildings, community centers. We've had proposals for a spaceport to launch rockets to Mars, etc. So there's so much going on. It's really been a phenomenal success with great political will behind it. So it's a work in progress. We now have 75% of the people in the Western Islands of Scotland live on community-owned land. It's normal there as a normal option, which is absolutely fantastic. But the scale and the concentration of land ownership patterns have remained relatively the same. So last year there were 22 private estates sold in rural Scotland in 2020, and half of those were traded off the market. So that gives you a sense for the global extraction of wealth in rural areas continues. Similarly, related issue is that a third of the population in Scotland, and this would be in the urban parts of Scotland, lives within 500 meters of a vacant or derelict site. There's a picture there of one, but and many of these are locations of wealth extraction where there's been lack of investment, and then ultimately it's derelict. It's this community right to buy, which is for sustainable development, is the name, but what that introduces is an absolute sale from a private owner where there is evidence of harm, and it has to be in the interest of sustainable development. And there's quite a lot of legal language around that, and I look forward to seeing it tested in the, as a community is brave enough to take one of those rights through. It'll be exciting. So ultimately, in Scotland, what's been going on is a reforming of how we understand the relationship of people and land and ownership. So we've got land reform, which is creating a new system of land rights where communities have increased power. There's so many aspects to land reform, community ownership being one of them, but part of this is that land ownership comes with rights and responsibilities. So it's about caretaking land and the responsibilities that come with that, not just unsustainable extraction of wealth from land. It's about creating socially just forms of land ownership, where we're diversifying the type of land that's held in the common good with increased local community rights and how those relate to other types of land that are held in the public good. And it's for everyone everywhere. So it's not something that's just for rural Scotland, but rather bringing transformative change to urban areas and throughout Scotland. Community ownership, it's a means to an end. So inclusive ownership and socially just use of land produces other things that we want to be doing. It gives control and power over land and assets to communities in perpetuity. So you could think about this as a pre-distribution of wealth instead of redistribution of wealth, which is what economic systems have traditionally been focused on over the last 100 years or so. This is getting at the fundamental basis of power and land. And the other thing to bear in mind is that community owners are resilient organizations. They tend to be community anchors doing amazing work. They've been responding to COVID-19 and doing all sorts of locally specific work that's required to keep communities afloat, keep things going, sort things out. They've been doing amazing work around climate change for quite some time, you know, building renewable energy grids, et cetera. And they're well placed to have that resilience to respond to what's next. So it's this long-term investment in creation of a new type of commons that we could think of as being extra local. I've got a few examples here now to give you some sense of what's been happening in community ownership. There's a wealth of examples, and if you're interested in this, check out our website and look around the web, check out the websites of these organizations I'm going to talk about. In Glasgow, there's been some amazing successes of groups, particularly pictures here of Govan Hill Baths and Kinning Park Complex, who occupied their historic buildings 20 years ago or so, and have recently become owners in the last few years under the land reform legislation, and have been doing amazing work over COVID and before that. COVID in some senses made them ratchet it up, just watching from afar, and really they've been working so quickly to respond to things, and they've got actually contractors on site, both of those, turning them into amazing new buildings while refurbishing them for the future uses. But it's not all historic buildings in urban Scotland. The example here is View Park in North Lanarkshire, which is on the edge of Glasgow. The community came together there to respond to some planning applications about 15 years ago to expand an industrial park, and ultimately they bought out the largest urban land buyout last year, which is this area of parkland between the motorway, which is the main motorway between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and their small community, which has a number of deprivation measures, including particularly health, asthma, things like that. So taking this woodland into community ownership and holding that in perpetuity. I think they've just hired a ranger, and they're putting up signs so that people can continue to enjoy that amazing recreation facility. And then talking about the work at Mid Steeple Quarter in Dumfries. This was an artist-led community regeneration project. I've put a picture here of the grottiest image of the inside of the building, which I don't usually show to people, but I think it's very striking. So what's been going on in Dumfries is there's a series of the high street, which had turned over to chain shops, and then those chain shops were lying derelict, they were abandoned, and in some cases on the ground floor, the ground floor space had been ripped apart to turn into sort of a unit of global consumerist consumption. And when, you know, in some cases they took out the staircases, they didn't repair the buildings particularly well. It was just all focused on this ground floor sort of generic commercial space while the buildings were sort of crumbling around it. And then ultimately landlords pulled out because of market failure, and the buildings were lying there derelict. So the community has come together. They've bought up, it's hard to keep track of where they are in their development plans, but I think they've got 5 buildings. The sketch at the bottom is from their master plan. And they're on site now, which is quite exciting on phase 1, building up across the center of Dumfries. So community ownership, it's a work in progress. There's been great successes in the rural areas looking back 25 years or more, and in the first 5 years of urban community ownership. But looking forward, you know, now is time to scale up. Given the challenges of COVID, given the challenges of climate change, you know, it's looking forward very much about building the future with community ownership at its heart. Community ownership, as we see it, should be a mainstream option for local, democratically accountable development and land management. It should be, you know, needs to be on the community's terms. So where communities want to come forward and take on assets, it should just be a standard thing with resources in place, and people are well aware of it as an option in Scotland that is within our reach, and what we're working on implementing. There's a concern with market failures around COVID that there's pressure on communities to take on failed assets and liabilities, and that shouldn't be happening. Communities need to have access to resources and expertise to understand what are the best things for them to take on. And as we see it, the biggest potential is in community buyout of private land and assets, bringing these within the commons. That's the history of community land Scotland, with our history within rural areas of taking, supporting communities and buying out large estates. And in urban areas, similarly, we're very much focused on helping communities buy out from private owners. So 2 more slides to get a sense of the project that I'm running for Community Land Scotland. Community Land Scotland's been working on urban community ownership for 5 years, since land reform was implemented in urban areas. And as part of responding to the challenges that they understand in these areas, they've implemented a place-based approach to accelerate community ownership, The first project is in Glasgow in the Clyde Valley. It's about investing resources in a local area and working through the issues there to accelerate community ownership. It's a single gateway for community ownership. We will be supporting groups with buyouts. If anyone's in Glasgow wants to talk to us, that will be absolutely great. Or we'll be pointing you in the direction of the support services if it's something that we don't do, because we are a small team. We're focused on the private sector, as I was explaining, because we think that's the most exciting part of all of this. And we act strategically to change the conditions for community ownership. So we also do promotion like this event and action research projects around key challenges for community ownership, looking to push things forward. So over the next year, we're just finalizing plans to do some really exciting and interesting work on inequality and inclusion in community ownership, around privately held vacant and derelict land, and on planning obligations and other things. So if you're interested in seeing how our work on that, stay in touch or follow the website. And if you want to know more, we're having an urban community land gathering on the 27th. If you want to talk about that, anyone in Scotland is welcome to come to that. And there's the election manifesto, because we have an election coming up in Scotland soon. There are the websites to find out more. So thanks for listening.
Okay, thanks very much, Carey. Thanks. Oh, could you stop sharing your screen, please? Okay. Thanks. Yeah, it's great to see how much land and assets been taken into community ownership for the past few years. Great. Please leave any questions or comments in the chat, and I'm just going to move on now to Thomas from the Democracy Collaborative.
Hi, good morning, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Thomas Hanna. I'm the research director at the Democracy Collaborative based here in the US. I'm also currently a PhD student at the University of Glasgow, so I'm especially honored to have been invited to chat with you all today. So first, I'm going to just talk a little bit about my organization, the Democracy Collaborative, and what we do, and then I'm going to discuss the concept of democratic public ownership, which is something that I personally have been working on quite a lot over the past couple of years. So the Democracy Collaborative is an R&D lab for a more democratic and reparative economy. This means that we work at various scales throughout the political economic system to develop and implement new models and approaches that point in the direction of a next system beyond corporate capitalism, a system that we hope is by design racially and economically equitable, democratic, and ecologically sustainable. So we believe that alternative models of ownership are at the heart of this next system and also at the heart of the ways that we might get to this next system. This is because patterns of ownership are central to any political economic system, and this has been true throughout history. It was also acutely understood by the architects of the neoliberal project, who have really facilitated a massive transfer of ownership from collective and public hands to private hands over the past 4 years. And just a really quick aside, I really find it irritating that many of these same people, these neoliberals, now tell us that ownership doesn't matter and that we should really be focusing our energy solely on regulation or internal management processes and so on, when they went and privatized almost the entire world, over the past several decades. So anyway, at TDC, we focus on advancing and developing a variety of alternative ownership models and approaches that collectively serve to transfer ownership and control of enterprises and assets from the hands of the few to the hands of the many. And this includes things like cooperatives, publicly owned enterprises, commons approaches, employee-owned firms, community ownership, social enterprises, and so on and so forth. Many of the things that have been already talked about by the other great presenters today. So in the late 2000s, we helped set up the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, if anyone doesn't know, is a pretty deindustrialized city in the US Rust Belt that's experienced pretty significant economic and social dislocation in the past several decades. So Evergreen is loosely modeled on the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain and consists of several worker-owned cooperatives linked together by a community-controlled corporation and connected to the procurement needs of large public or nonprofit anchor institutions in the area. And by anchor institutions, I mean things like hospitals, universities, city government, and so on. Evergreen is a pretty innovative hybrid model of ownership that combines worker ownership with elements of community control. So in practice, this means that while the workers in the individual cooperatives receive a share of their company's profits, in addition to above market wages and benefits, they cannot unilaterally decide to sell the company to the private sector, for instance, or to move its operations out of the community to another community. These types of high-level decisions are made collectively by the network as a whole, which includes representatives from the cooperatives, but also representatives from various stakeholders in the wider community. So currently Evergreen is up to 5 worker cooperatives with 320 or so worker owners. This includes a large-scale green laundry, ecologically sustainable laundry, and one of the largest urban greenhouses in the United States. The network has also recently established a multi-million-dollar acquisition fund that will purchase local companies, convert them to worker ownership, and integrate them into the overall Evergreen network. And so I'm happy to answer any further questions about Evergreen or any of our other community wealth building work later on, but now I'll just pivot a little bit to some of my recent work on democratic public ownership, which, like Evergreen, is a new hybrid model that aims to overcome some of the limitations of past alternative ownership forms and to really advance economic democracy and system change in the modern economy. So first of all, what is public ownership? I define public ownership as assets, services, and enterprises that are owned collectively by all people in a specific geographic area and managed either directly or through representative structures. Some modern conceptions of public ownership are a bit broader and include most non-private or not-for-profit forms of ownership, things like cooperatives and social enterprises and so on. However, I believe that it's actually important to distinguish public ownership not just from private businesses, but also from cooperatives and other forms of democratically owned enterprises, as these other forms are still owned and managed by some smaller subset of a general population. So in addition to distributing the fruits of ownership as broadly as possible, one of the key benefits of public ownership for me is that it's a really flexible ownership form that can be used to address whatever needs are prioritized by a local population. And most importantly, this means that publicly owned enterprises are not necessarily constrained by or beholden to market imperatives such as growth, profit, and competition. And also, public ownership is still broadly popular and commonplace. Despite what I said earlier about the neoliberals privatizing everything in sight, public ownership is actually very popular and common throughout the rest of the world, throughout most of the world. And I won't get into it too much here, but a couple of years ago, I wrote a book on public ownership in the United States, describing the very surprising scope and scale of public ownership here. And this included things like thousands of electric and water and gas utilities, all of our commercial airports, most of our ports, around 1/3 of all of our land, real estate in almost every community, public marketplaces, all of our intercity passenger rail service, several giant, massive sovereign wealth funds, mostly in conservative states in the West, almost all of our country's public transportation systems, our buses, our subways, et cetera. We have around 500 publicly owned broadband internet networks now, which has been an area where there's been a lot of growth in recent years. Our post office is still publicly owned. We have a lot of state level public enterprises, things like a publicly owned bank in North Dakota. North Dakota also has a giant agricultural processing facility called the North Dakota Mill. Many states own alcohol distribution facilities and lotteries and so much more. Also, unlike in the UK, when we do privatize something in the United States, it usually takes the form of a private operating contract where the underlying asset remains publicly owned rather than an outright fire sale of the asset itself. And so this means that the contract can and often is canceled when the private sector delivers poor service or higher costs or so on. And this has happened repeatedly, for instance, in the water sector in the past couple of decades, where something has been, quote unquote, privatized, it being contract out, and then the contract has been canceled and brought back in-house. And this is something that has been happening not just in the US, but also around the world. And we call it commonly remunicipalization, basically taking some sort of service or asset or enterprise that has been outsourced or privatized to the private sector and bringing it back in-house and bringing it back to public ownership. And I would really urge people to check out, there's a new global database of remunicipalization cases that has been created by some of my colleagues at the University of Glasgow, but also at the Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam. The database can be found at publicfutures.org. So moving on, simply defending or expanding public ownership for me is only one part of the puzzle. Really traditional forms of public ownership, as people probably know, have been really kind of overly top-down, very managerial, very opaque, very unaccountable, the traditional state-owned enterprise that I think many people are very familiar with. And while there's, some degree of public control there through representative government, on a whole, this has been really sorely lacking, I think, in most public enterprises over the years. In my experience, almost nobody in the modern movement for public ownership wants to go back to or to sort of perpetuate this older model of public ownership. However, we're also told by groups like, the OECD and the EU and, IMF and others that the only other model for public ownership is corporatization, essentially to remove public ownership as much as possible from democratic control and accountability and have it run basically like a private for-profit corporation. And needless to say, I think that we must also reject that model as well. And what we really need is a new model of public ownership, and one that my colleagues and I have termed democratic public ownership. And so democratic public ownership centers worker and community participation and control, increases transparency and accountability, and enshrines values such as equity, sustainability, and social benefit. And because of this, for me, democratic public ownership combines both the distributional benefits of widespread ownership with the individual and collective benefits of increased empowerment and agency. And I won't go too much more into the model here, but if anyone's interested in more details, there's a couple of really good publications out there, including one that I wrote myself with Professor Andrew Cumbers at the University of Glasgow called Constructing the Democratic Public Enterprise. There's another one by the public ownership campaign group We Own It in the UK, which is an absolutely fantastic group. The report's called When We Own It. So it's looking at what would be the structure of public services for the 21st century once they're brought back in-house. And both of these reports, as well as many others, have examples of best practices from around the world, as well as proposed principles and design sketches and so on and so forth. So moving on, I'll talk a little bit now, I think, about how democratic public ownership applies to our modern digital economy. And usually when people think about alternative models of ownership, not just public ownership, but also things like cooperatives, their minds often go to things like traditional public services and utilities like water, electricity, transportation, food, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And while I think we definitely still need to be fighting to advance public and cooperative and community ownership approaches in these sectors, we also need to start thinking about the technology and information sectors that are increasingly becoming the sort of new quote unquote commanding heights of our modern economy. And so here I'm talking about things like digital infrastructure, fiber and wireless networks, cloud computing services, wireless spectrum, intellectual property, research and development, data, platforms, and so on and so forth. And over the past year, my organization and me specifically, we worked with Commonwealth, which some of you may know is a great UK-based think tank, to put out a series of reports and policy proposals on how democratic public ownership could really underpin a new way of thinking about ownership in these areas. And for instance, in order to avoid some of the rampant social and economic inequities deriving from unequal internet access, something that I think we've all seen in many of our countries around the recent pandemic, we proposed things like publicly owned fiber networks. And these would build out on the hundreds that I mentioned already exist in the United States, and also what was proposed in the UK by the Labour Party a few years ago, and which was derided by the Tories as, quote unquote, broadband communism. I don't know if anyone remembers that one. We also proposed things like, diverting proceeds from wireless spectrum auctions into democratically governed, publicly owned social wealth funds that would support local journalism and really counter misinformation and corporate control. We suggested patent pools and IP commons to stimulate innovation and ensure that technology and critical products like publicly funded vaccines are more equitably distributed both domestically and also internationally around the world. We proposed taking some of the largest big tech platforms into public ownership and also linking increased public R&D funding to the development of new platforms that are cooperative or publicly owned, and so much more. So I'd encourage people to check out those reports if people are interested in those subjects. Each one contains an analysis of that particular sector as it currently stands, including things like the degree of corporate concentration and control and monopolization, principles and goals for democratic public ownership, and then they also include a number of concrete policy proposals that build off real world precedents. So it's not just pie in the sky stuff. All the stuff that we talk about exists and has real world practice behind it. So just to conclude, I want to stress that in general, for me, I believe that our modern economy has plenty of room for a really diverse mix of democratic ownership models or plural forms of ownership, especially in the short term. And I'm really interested in ways in which more traditional forms of public ownership and the public sector in general can really help to enable and embed and support other types of democratic ownership models, such as cooperatives, such as community land trusts, such as many of the other things that people have talked about today. And things like, platform cooperatives, multi-stakeholder cooperatives. There's a lot of really interesting innovation, in these community-based models that I think really can be linked up to the public sector in different ways to help scale and to really help get beyond some of the limitations to scale that these institutions and these approaches have experienced by themselves. For instance, I always think back to the US and in North Dakota, for instance, I mentioned earlier that we have a publicly owned bank and a large publicly owned agricultural facility there. And these publicly owned institutions at the state level have really helped to support the development of a really robust ecosystem of cooperatives and small businesses in the state. When we had a financial crisis 10 years ago, Bank of North Dakota had the lowest rate of foreclosures. It had no bank failures. It had a really sort of robust ecosystem, and because of what had been set up by the Bank of North Dakota. In Emilia-Romagna in Italy, many people may know about that area as being a sort of a hub of cooperative and a really dense area of small businesses and cooperatives. The existence of publicly owned planning and economic development entities in the post-World War II period really helped that region develop and develop from one of the poorest regions in Italy to being one of the most richest regions in all of the European Union. In New York City and other cities in the US and around the world, we're also seeing in the modern context a lot of increasing energy around using municipal budgets and using public enterprises and agencies to provide funding and technical support for the development of cooperatives, for the development of community ownership forms like community land trusts and so on and so forth. So in the modern economy, I believe that public and commons approaches to digital infrastructure, as I was mentioning, intellectual property, research and development, finance, data, and so on, can really help to facilitate the proliferation and growth of worker or consumer cooperatives, community ownership forms, and so on. And I think together, all of these things, if we can knit them together, we can really start to displace the big corporate platforms, the big corporate big tech companies, and the big corporations in general that monopolize so many aspects of our economy in so many sectors. And I think by doing this, we could also sort of mitigate some of the limitations and pressures faced by individual cooperatives or by community ownership forms that currently sort of exist in this really hard sea of capitalism, that really isolates them. And we can really start to maximize the benefits of community ownership forms and cooperatives and publicly owned enterprises as well in terms of both our ownership rights and our democratic governance. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it there. I'm very interested in the conversation and would love to discuss more in the Q&A. So thank you all for having me, and I really look forward to the rest of this.
Thanks, Thomas. That was great. Really interesting. Cool. Well, part of the purpose of having the three speakers was to hear kind of different perspectives on ownership, kind of from things and tool libraries to land and assets to then infrastructure and digital platforms and intellectual property, and how these things cross, like the similarities between them and where they conflict and where they can maybe support each other. So first of all, I just want to ask Carey, Sabrina, and Thomas whether any of them have any questions or comments for each other. But there's a few questions as well in the chat, so we can come to them. But is there anything that anyone wants to kind of bring up? Or we can just go straight to some questions. I think one, first of all, for you, Sabrina, it was mentioned at the beginning, was just someone asking, what was your criticism of the circular economy?
Yeah, sure. So there's a few. So first of all, a lot of circular economy, and with a lot, it doesn't mean that all organization, but if you look at the circular economy, they say we should go beyond the linear model of, take, make, and dispose. And but there's no reference to the social aspect, for example, of the circular economy. Who needs to own this circular economy now, right? And we see that more and more, like, circular economy means H&M or this big brand taking clothes back to India for some slavery recycling process or stuff like that. Also, if we look at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is the reference for the circular economy, and if you look at the sponsor at the below, and you can go and check now on the internet. One of their main supporters is BlackRock, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, investment corporation asset management company. So these one are, you know, they're like the fundamental forces of today's modern capitalism. So there is when I saw that, I lost all faith that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation could actually lead a circular economy for all.
Okay, thanks. Carey, there's a question for you on how community asset transfers, or how the community can take ownership of housing in an urban setting.
Yeah, there we are. Two different questions. So asset transfer from public authorities, there's a right for communities to do that in Scotland under the 2015 Empowerment Act, although local authorities were doing asset transfer before that. And it's very much a process. So, you know, if somebody has a particular question about that, there's lots of resources out there and support for that. So I'm guessing it was a question from Scotland, who's maybe someone who's interested in doing that. And I would say get in touch and we can explain the process. I don't know if it was a more theoretical question about that process. There's a great deal of there's a lot of examples of communities that have taken over assets that are being held by public authorities. It's a way to bring in that sort of locally, democratically accountable management of those assets. There's, you know, it's clear that there are going to be more assets that public authorities in Scotland are probably going to struggle to resource the current assets that they have, given the realities of coming back from COVID. So there's a lot to be said about next steps on that. But perhaps it's a different discussion, or I can go into it more if people have particular questions about it. In terms of housing, that's actually something we're working on, which I didn't mention so much in my talk. But there's the history of housing in Scotland is somewhat unique because there's such a great history of housing associations. But at the minute in urban Scotland, there's not support for small scale community-led housing because most of it's provided by housing associations. But there is support for community-led rural housing. So one of the things that Community-Led Scotland has been working on is identifying that as a problem and advocating for next steps so that communities can put in place housing where it's part of where they want to. Ultimately, they should have the support and that decision about where housing should be made by the communities. It's also clear that that's a key part for a number of our members around revenue. So a lot of community owners in Scotland where they've maybe taken on more than one site, they're really effective developers in that sense, where they've got lots of different things happening on different sites and different types of developments. It could be community-led businesses while they're taking on an asset from a public authority, and then they're also taking on board something from a private, and they're balancing all those out revenue streams in terms of understanding how to do business. And housing is a key part of that for them, so they can extract some wealth from that, dare I say. There's clearly a lot to be thinking about there.
Can I just jump in real quick from the US experience? In the US, I mentioned community land trusts a few times, and in the US, community land trusts are almost all around housing, organized around housing, and they've sort of, there's other types of land trusts that are more about, you know, sort of rural land and agricultural land, but community land trusts in the US have, I think, doubled just in the past 15 years. It's an area where a lot of people are very interested. And also, again, you know, to my point about sort of connecting up strategies, and it's also an area where people are thinking about connecting up this question of publicly owned land to community land trusts. And so, you know, some communities, well, many communities in the US have things called land banks, which are essentially government entities which can take land into public ownership in various ways and for various purposes. Most of them are terribly, used. They basically take land or housing into public ownership and then they sell it back to the private sector, to developers. So people are thinking about things like a land bank to a land trust pipeline. So how do you take the land or the housing that is taken into public ownership by the city and then transfer it over to a community group to turn into a community land trust? There's also a really interesting model in the US called Dudley Street Initiative in Boston, which has been around for a very long time. But in, I think, the 1980s, the city actually gave a community group eminent domain powers, which is essentially the city's ability to seize land. And they gave it to a community group to basically take ownership of land in this community's area. Vacant, foreclosed land. The community was basically a trash site for people just dumping things. And they actually created a community land trust and have really, really innovative participatory models in terms of governance and representation in that community. So I urge people to check that out.
Yeah, and to pick up on the differences in different places and talking about community land trusts and housing. So community trusts in Scotland would own all types of assets. So when I was giving those examples of that vast range of different types of things that community owners are developing, they would all be doing that work often as trusts, but there's other government structures as well. In England, for example, there's a lot of support for community-led housing through the trust model, but not so much in Scotland. So there's differences between England and Scotland and in America, and I'm sure in Australia and throughout the world. And it strikes me that there's a lot to be done in terms of connecting this up so that we can understand, share examples and understand, what's working, what's not working, and advocate for this change on a global scale.
Thanks very much. I've got a question from Zoe, who's said, sorry, hang on. The process of undertaking a community land transfer buyout can be quite an undertaking for residents on the ground. What has already been done needs to be done to make these an inclusive and accessible process beyond participation from the usual suspects.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge undertaking, a community land buyout. The examples I was giving, most of those groups have been doing it for 20 years. That's the types of scale. It doesn't always take that long, but it's a huge undertaking, and it's very clear that there's equity issues around access to resources, around, you have to remember that many of the vast majority of the groups involved are running entirely on volunteers. So there's a lot of work being done around how to connect up groups that are starting out, early stage groups, which is one of the things we're focusing on at Community Land Scotland, but which is also that other people are working on. So how do you take groups that are starting out that need resources and are clearly facing, equity issues in terms of access to those, link them up with maybe more established groups, what additional support is needed, etc. But it's not clear what works yet, which is why we need to try out different things in that action research style and share learning.
I would just add, there's also another question in the chat, I think, about how to start up cooperative or community projects in terms of capital and, in terms of the funding needed. And I'll sort of combine, I think, my answer to both of those questions together and just say, from the US experience, we see a lot of, or we're starting to see a lot of energy around putting in place the sort of supportive infrastructure that's necessary to do community-based, or cooperative-based projects. For instance, a big, as the person in the chat mentioned, a big problem to scaling or starting cooperatives in general has been, at least in the US, that banks don't really lend to cooperatives, right? They don't understand that model. So how do we start thinking differently about that? And so there are organizations out there, the Working World, Shared Capital Cooperative, many other technical assistants, Democracy at Work Institute, US Federation of Worker Cooperatives. There's all of these groups, or most of them have started in the past 10 or 15 years around providing both the technical assistance to groups who are looking to start community projects and also to finance community projects, but also, also in terms of linking up, as I mentioned, to the state. These are sort of nonprofit organizations. We also are starting to see, as I mentioned, New York City is starting to allocate part of its municipal budget to the development of cooperatives or community land trusts, and they're routing them through these technical support institutions that have developed. We also have things called worker ownership centers. So we have, like, for instance, the Vermont Employee Ownership Center or the Ohio Employee Ownership Center. And these are technical assistance providers that get some funding from the state. Bernie Sanders, when he was in Congress, gave, or managed to allocate a couple $100,000 to the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. And these have been really shown to be real catalysts. Vermont, Ohio, for instance, both have higher densities of worker cooperatives or employee-owned businesses because of the existence of these technical support centers. So this is what a really good example of, I think, linking up the public sector, the nonprofit sector to these community development or community organizing efforts from the ground.
Thanks. There's a question maybe to ask to Sabrina, which is about to what extent do these ideas about ownership have to be complemented by new thinking on people's needs and wants, referring to Kate Sopper's alternative hedonism, which I think, yeah, how do we change our kind of values around our needs and wants?
Thanks for the question, Roger, I think. Well, actually, I was just reflecting on that because we hear a lot about cooperatives or like, these kind of business models, but often they are still like business as usual. So I think, if a cooperative is still producing goods that we don't really need to achieve that ecological and social well-being, then we're already losing the fight, the ecological fight at least. So I think, yeah, the real thinking should go into not what we own only, but what for. And in the environmental movement, we speak a lot about renewable energy. We need renewable energy. We need renewable energy for everything. But really, we need just less energy consumption in absolute terms. So because even if we, have renewable energy everywhere, but if growth continues, then we will never have enough renewable energy, even if it's owned by cooperative or by the community. So I think that links to that shift on value and understanding which role do we want to have in the economy and what do we want this economy to look like. And I might just add one thing to the funding question. So practically, we always refused funding from philanthropists in Australia, just because most of the philanthropists, they want something that is called DGR status, which basically means that they can deduct it from taxes. So for us, we had this conversation several times, and every now and then with different volunteers, we discuss it in the sense that they're not really philanthropists, they're just avoiding to pay the taxes. So for us, that's not really a donation. We did have some grants from Brisbane City Council, and we never had any from government. And I can see that would be a good resource to tap into it, but also at the same time, we always try to make sure that we have complete freedom to criticize, if needed, those institutions, so that we are not dependent on any one funding. So for example, with the Glasgow Tool Library, we're more or less self-sufficient, acknowledging that we don't have any rent, and that's usually one of the highest costs for this kind of projects.
Thanks, Sabrina. I've got a question aimed towards Thomas, which is just the, you mentioned the Labour policy, which is kind of derided by the Conservatives as like internet communism or broadband communism. But how do we kind of change people's mindsets to think of these things as, I think there's a lot of the values and principles that we hold are very much based around private ownership. How do we start to begin to change the people's mindsets on these big things like digital platforms and intellectual property?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I guess I'll probably hedge or dodge a little bit that question and say that I think, when you get down to it, when you get past the spin, when you get past the propaganda, things like community ownership, things like public ownership are actually generally popular and are already popular. We see this in the United States a lot. A lot of our public ownership is actually in very conservative areas, politically conservative areas, things like water utilities. And when you go to a local community and you say to a community, even in a Republican area, do you want to privatize your water utility and give it over to this giant international corporation? The answer is usually no. And people usually organize and mobilize against that. And I think you're starting to see in the US, but also in around the world, the era of privatization, I think, hopefully, fingers crossed, is somewhat coming to an end, at least conceptually, at least since the financial crisis 10 years ago. And now with the current COVID crisis, I think people are really starting to see the limitations of this really hyper free market privatization, type of approach to things. And people are starting to think about, again, more about common ownership or collective or public ownership. So I don't really have a good answer to how you increase that, except to continually point out the failures of privatization and continue to point out the failures of free market approaches that are evident before people's eyes. They just need to really see behind the propaganda, behind the spin and so on. And I guess maybe the only other thing I would say is capitalize on crises. I mean, it sounds crass, but like when there was a big financial crisis 10 years ago in the United States, there was a big opportunity there, a big opening in the public consciousness to really talk about Wall Street, to really talk about, these, privatized financial instruments, this really speculative type of economy, and the Occupy movement. And so, I don't think we fully embraced that opportunity 10 years ago, but we did. I do think you see the sort of narrative changing a little bit. And now with the COVID crisis, and you mentioned broadband internet, I think it's been we're all on Zoom right now. We've all been in a remote, everybody knows, or a lot of people can see how inequitable internet access is and how much you're disadvantaged in this type of a pandemic. If you're in a place with poor internet access, if you're in a rural area, or if you're in an urban community where you can't afford, good quality internet access. So using this opportunity to really drive home that message that broadband internet should be a universal basic service. It should be affordable or free even. And we're starting to do that in the United States as well. There's a lot of legislation. The Democratic Party in the United States is generally supportive of broadband as infrastructure. It's in Joe Biden's infrastructure plan and so on and so forth. So we're trying to capitalize on this opportunity now to really hammer that message home.
I can pick up on a few points, I think, which synthesize nicely with that. I mean, from a Scottish perspective, we benefit from political will for land reform across all the political parties. So I say that to clarify that this can also happen at the political level where this can all be supported. I mean, there's questions around funding, as Sabrina was walking through, and how critical you can be if you're funded by the government, and that's definitely a tightrope walk. But ultimately, I think don't forget that the government works for us, and governments exist that can support these types of things and create things like the Scottish Land Fund, which provides the support, £10 million a year, or £10 million per funding round to community owners. So all of these things do exist in Scotland, which, for example, don't exist in England, the Community Land Fund, which I think would definitely support their acquisition of housing and other community ownership goals in England and elsewhere. So dream big and advocate politically as well.
I might add to that. I feel one major barrier that I encounter a lot in this kind of discussion is, this is great, more public spaces, more common project, but how are we going to pay for it? And that's where a lot of political parties from the left end up saying, we might have to raise taxes, and people don't like it, and then vote on the right, and then everything gets privatized. But there's a really interesting book of Mariana Mazzucato called The Entrepreneurial State. It's still based on private ownership, but Mazzucato says, what if the government would actually keep some kind of intellectual property on what they invent, like the Wi-Fi, the microwave and things. She says that Apple didn't invent anything. They just took all this technology that has been invented from the state, put it together and makes profit out of it. So there are ways, and there are macroeconomies that are actually exploring ways to create, public revenue without taxing more people. And I think that should be also something to look at. How can we create that wealth, reclaiming it back from that profit-driven system?
Okay, well, thanks very much. We just have to have passed, so I think we should call it an end there. But thanks very much, Sabrina, Carey, and Thomas. It's been really great. And thanks everybody for coming today. The event's proven very popular. So I think we're potentially going to maybe run a series of these events exploring ownership in different contexts from different perspectives. And we're also interested in what ideas other people might have. So get in touch if you have any ideas that we think we should explore. Thanks for coming. Thanks to those who donated to us via Eventbrite. We're a small organization, so any money goes a long way towards running our service and putting on events like this. If you want to support us more, the best way to do that is to become a member. So you can become a member for £20 a year. It's soon going to maybe go up to £25. So if you get one quick, you'll save yourself a £5. And yeah, you can find out more about us at our website, which is www.glasgowtoollibrary.com. So thanks very much for coming, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.